Some men are broken by solitude, others are sharpened to a blade by it. For 10 years, Jonah Hale had lived alone in the high country, convinced he was too dangerous for any woman to share his fire. The people down in Bear Creek Valley called him a beast, a shadow of the bloody feud that had driven him into the mountains. He'd sworn off towns, sworn off people, especially women, and made the wilderness his only companion. But one pale spring morning, with his coffee jar nearly empty, Jonah rode down for supplies and found a crowd gathered outside the clapboard church. The sharp clang of its bell cut through the morning air, summoning folks for something that didn't smell like Sunday worship. A wedding auction. Women were being matched to men they hardly knew. Jonah meant to pass by until he saw her, Anna Mercer. Standing stiff at the altar rail, her chin high but her eyes far away, like a woman trying to leave her own body. She was about to be married off to Harold Pike, the town's banker, a man twice her age and 3 times her weight in greed, to pay her dead father's debts. Something deep in Jonah's chest stirred, something he thought he'd buried with his past. Before he'd even thought it through, he was moving. He shouldered his way into that crowded church like a storm coming through the pines. Every head turned. He stopped halfway down the aisle and said in a voice that carried to the rafters, "I ain't looked a woman in the eye in 10 years. The place went still. Harold Pike's smug grin faltered. Then Jonah stepped up beside Anna, cupped her face with hands that smelled of cedar and gun oil, and kissed her like a man who'd been starving for it. When he lifted his head, he looked straight at the preacher. "Marry us. Now." The morning mist still clung to Elk Spine Ridge when Jonah had stood on his own porch just hours earlier, unaware his life would change before the coffee cooled. Golden shafts of sunlight sliced through the lodgepole pines, painting the moss in warm tones. His tin cup steamed in his hands, black coffee so bitter it could raise the dead. It was the same ritual he'd kept for a decade, almost to the day. Not that he was counting. The knife on his belt caught the morning light, antler-handled, the blade honed to a razor's edge. His father had given it to him at 16, and his grandfather had carried it through the war. Sometimes when the forest was dead quiet, Jonah swore he could still hear his father's voice. A man's blade is an extension of his will. He was a big man, 6'4", wide in the shoulders, lean from hard work and harder winters. His beard had grown thick and uneven, his hair brushing his collar. His hands bore the pale scars of 100 small injuries, the kind you got splitting logs and fixing what no one else was around to fix. The town had called him a giant even before the exile. Now they called him a ghost. The feud that had sent him up here still burned clear in his mind. It had been overland, as these things often were. The Crowder family had wanted the Hale Valley for their cattle, and when Jonah's father wouldn't sell, the Crowders turned to other means, burned barns, poisoned wells, dead calves in the pasture. One October night, they'd come for his father with rope and kerosene. Jonah had met them at the fence line with his rifle and knife and told them to turn back or be buried on Hale land. They chose wrong. 3 Crowders died before sunrise. Jonah had stood over their bodies with the barn smoking behind him when the sheriff rode in with half the town. What he saw in their eyes wasn't respect. It was fear, the kind you reserve for wild animals. "Gone too far this time, Hale," the sheriff said, his hand hovering over his gun. "They came to my land," Jonah replied evenly. "Threatened my blood. A man's got the right to stand his ground." But the town had decided otherwise. His wife, Eliza, left him that week without a word, heading east on the stage. Supplies dried up, work offers stopped. Kids crossed the street when they saw him. By the first snowfall, Jonah had packed what was left of his life into a wagon and climbed into the mountains. His cabin sat in a bowl of rock and timber, the pass so narrow a single man could hold it with a rifle. He'd built it himself, tight log walls, a stone chimney that could drive the cold out of the farthest corners, windows turned south for the winter sun, a porch to catch the breeze on hot evenings. It was solid, built to outlast him. And it had, until this morning, been enough. But supplies were running low, and coffee, his one luxury, had become scarce as silver. So he saddled up and made the long ride down into Bear Creek. 20 miles away, Anna Mercer stood before a cracked mirror in the boarding house trying to steady her hands. The wedding dress had been pressed on her by Mrs. Pike in the name of charity, white satin gone yellow with age, smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. It didn't fit. It wasn't meant to. It was a reminder. This marriage wasn't her choice. She touched the silver locket at her throat, her father's last gift before fever took him. Inside, her mother's photograph and a lock of her baby brother's hair. All she had left of a family gone. Her father had been an honest man with a terrible eye for business. When he died, his debts passed to Anna like a chain. Harold Pike offered her a way out, marry him, and the debt would vanish. The wedding auction was his invention, a spectacle, a warning to others about what happened when you couldn't pay. She'd looked for another way out. There was none. The church bell rang. Mrs. Pike's voice drifted through the door. "Time to go, dear. Don't keep Harold waiting." Anna took one last look in the mirror, straightened her back, and walked out. She didn't know that Jonah Hale was already in town, or that he'd see her before the morning was done. The clappered church was bursting, every pew full, the air heavy with perfume and curiosity. Jonah slipped in at the back, intending only to trade pelts for coffee and leave. But the crowd's focus pulled him forward. 3 women stood at the front. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, tears running down her face. Beside her, a weary widow stared at the floor. And then there was Anna. Even from the back, Jonah saw the fight in her stance, the pride in her chin. Her hands trembled just enough for a man who knew fear to notice. Harold Pike stood at the altar, thin and pale, eyes like cold coins. He spun his words like silk. "We are gathered here in the spirit of charity." Jonah saw it for what it was, a show of power. One by one the women were matched, the girl to a rancher twice her age, the widow to a shopkeeper. Then Pike introduced Anna, his voice dripping satisfaction. No one stepped forward. Jonah watched Anna's eyes close for the briefest moment, and something in him snapped. He walked the aisle, boots loud on the plank floor, the crowd parting without thinking. "I ain't looked a woman in the eye in 10 years, he said. The church froze. He stepped beside her, close enough to smell lavender beneath the musty satin. "Marry us," he told the preacher. Before anyone could object, he bent and kissed her, not a polite peck, but a deliberate claiming, tempered with surprising care, like he was afraid she might break. For a heartbeat, she kissed him back. The room exploded in gasps and shouts. Pike went red. "You can't! She's promised to me!" "How much?" Jonah asked, turning to him. Pike blinked. "What? How much is the debt?" When Pike named the figure, half the crowd gasped. Jonah dropped a leather pouch onto the altar. Gold coins spilled in the sunlight. "Will that cover it?" The room went silent, save for the faint clink of gold settling on the wood. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Pike's thin lips pressed into a bloodless line as his eyes flicked between the coins and Jonah's face. The preacher, Reverend Morris, a wiry man more used to baptizing squalling infants than navigating public standoffs, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Well, if both parties are willing." Anna's eyes met Jonah's. They were the clear green of river water over stone, and in them he saw fear. Yes, but also something else. Defiance. "I am," Jonah said. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than she felt. "I am." The vows were spoken quickly, the ink still wet on the marriage register when Jonah took the certificate and folded it into his coat. "Mrs. Hale," he said, offering her his arm. The title struck her like a slap and a lifeline all at once. They stepped out into the spring light, the murmurs of the crowd following them down the steps. Jonah's horse was tied outside the mercantile, a big dapple-gray gelding with a calm, watchful eye. He helped her into the saddle with hands surprisingly gentle for their size. She was still trying to process what had just happened when he swung up behind her, his arms bracketing hers on the reins. The ride out of town was silent except for the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves on packed earth. By midday, the road had narrowed into a deer trail. Pines closed in overhead, their scent sharp and clean. The air thinned, and the sounds of town, wagon wheels, hammer blows, the endless talk, faded until all she could hear was the wind and the occasional jingle of the bridle. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. He glanced down at her, one eyebrow raised. "What did you expect?" "A brute," she admitted. "The stories in town are mostly true," he cut in, his voice even. "I've done things I'm not proud of, killed men, but not the wrong men. If that frightens you, I understand." She shook her head slightly. "It's not fear, it's—" She searched for the word. "Uncertainty." They rode a little longer in silence before she asked the question that had been pressing at her ribs since the church. "Are you going to hurt me?" He pulled the gelding to a stop so abruptly she had to grip the saddle horn to keep from sliding forward. Then he swung down and looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Never," he said simply. And something in the way he said it, quiet, unshaken, made her believe him completely. The trail grew steeper. She caught her first glimpse of his cabin as the sun slid toward the western peaks. She'd imagined a rough hut, maybe a lean-to patched with hides. What rose before her was solid. The logs were fitted so tight you couldn't slip a blade between them. The roof was cedar shake, weathered silver, with glass windows that caught the dying light. A wide porch wrapped around two sides, a pair of chairs set to catch the morning sun. "It's beautiful," she said before she could stop herself. He looked almost embarrassed. "Built it myself. Took 2 years. Figured if I was going to live in exile, might as well do it right." Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pine resin and wood smoke. A stone fireplace dominated the main room. The floors were planed smooth, the furniture hand-built, every surface speaking of patient, capable hands. He gestured toward a door in the far wall. "Bedroom's through there. I'll take the couch until—" He hesitated. "Until you say otherwise." The thought made her cheeks heat. "That's considerate. Thank you." She looked down at her feet, at the delicate shoes already scuffed from the ride. "I'm afraid I'm not prepared for mountain life." "We'll fix that," he said simply. "I've got things that'll do for now. When I go down for supplies again, I'll get you whatever you need." The kindness in his tone cut deeper than cruelty would have. That night, Anna lay in his bed, though it still felt like his bed, not theirs, listening to the sounds of him moving in the main room, banking the fire, latching the door, the quiet reassurance of someone making the home secure. For the first time in months, she drifted into sleep without a knot of dread in her chest. She woke to the steady thunk of an axe biting into wood. Morning light filtered through the glass, pale and cool. The smell of coffee drifted in from the other room, strong, dark, the kind of coffee that promised to strip the sleep right out of you. When she stepped into the main room, he was coming in with an armload of fresh split logs. "Morning," he said, setting them by the hearth. "Hope I didn't wake you." "The coffee smells wonderful," she said. He poured her a tin cup. "Might want to add water. I brew it thick enough to float a horseshoe." It was bitter enough to make her eyes water, but it was hot and it was real. "I should probably learn to make it," she said, "along with everything else. My education didn't exactly cover this." "What did it cover?" he asked. "Music, French, watercolor, embroidery? Things meant to make me a good wife. In a parlor, not in a pine cabin." "Can you read?" "Yes," she said, a touch sharply. "Good." He crossed to a wooden chest, lifted the lid, and took out a thick leather-bound book. "This was my mother's. 30 years of notes, recipes, remedies, how to keep a fire through the night, how to treat a fever, everything she learned worth passing on." Anna turned the pages carefully. The handwriting was neat, the margins filled with penciled corrections. A page on bread making carried a note in a different hand. "Add a pinch more salt when the air's damp." "She must have been remarkable," Anna said. "She was," Jonah replied softly. "Raised 4 of us out here before there was a road. Buried 2. Never complained." Anna looked up and found him watching her, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with something that felt like consideration. By afternoon, she had burned her first biscuits, boiled coffee into sludge, and nearly smoked them both out by shutting the stove damper wrong. Each time he corrected her with the same even patience, showing her a trick or a better way. It wasn't just that he was teaching her mountain skills, it was that he never made her feel foolish for not knowing. That evening, while he was outside tending to his horse, she explored the cabin. At the foot of the bed she found a cedar chest. Inside, folded and smelling faintly of lavender, was the most beautiful quilt she had ever seen, rings of deep blue and gold interlocking in perfect symmetry. "That was my mother's wedding quilt," Jonah said from the doorway. She started, folding it quickly. "I shouldn't have. It's meant to be used," he said, stepping inside. "She made it the winter before she married my father. Said a quilt's like a marriage, bits and pieces stitched together until they make something stronger than the parts." The words hung between them. For a moment she thought he might close the space and kiss her. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Dinner in an hour." 3 days later, Jonah returned from town with a sack of flour, a bundle of new clothes for her, and a thin packet of mail. He set the supplies on the table, sorting through the letters with a frown. Anna noticed it immediately. "Something wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid one folded sheet across the table to her. It wasn't a letter. It was a poster. Her breath caught as she took in the crude woodcut of Jonah's face. Below it, in heavy black letters, "Wanted, dead or alive. Jonah Hale. Murder, stage robbery, horse theft, $500 reward." Anna looked up sharply. "Is this true?" "Some of it," he said. "Not the way they tell it." She felt the weight of the paper in her hand. $500 was a fortune out here, enough to tempt even an honest man to do something reckless. "Why now?" "Word travels slow in the mountains," he said, eyes hardening, "but it travels." That evening, after dinner, he led her out to a clearing behind the cabin. The snowmelt creek whispered nearby, and the air had that sharp coppery scent that comes just before nightfall. He handed her a rifle. "If someone comes up that trail with bad intentions, you need to know how to protect yourself." She'd never held a gun before. It felt heavier than it looked, the wood warm from his hands. He stood close behind her, adjusting her stance. "Feet shoulder width. Lean into it, not away. Keep your cheek on the stock." His voice was low, steady, a metronome against the pounding in her chest. The first shot kicked back into her shoulder hard enough to make her gasp. He caught her before she lost her footing. "Better," he said. Again. 2 mornings later, the air was too still. No bird call, no wind through the pines, just the sound of the creek running like a vein through the land. Jonah stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, scanning the tree line. Anna came to stand beside him. "What is it?" He didn't answer, just handed her the cup and went back inside for his rifle. The first gunshot cracked the air like splitting wood. It hit the porch post a foot from where she stood, splintering the cedar. "Inside!" Jonah barked. She dove through the doorway as another round punched into the cabin wall. Jonah slammed the door and shoved the heavy oak bar into place. Through the narrow chink between logs, she saw them, 3 figures moving low between the trees. One of them was Briggs. The other 2 she didn't recognize, but they carried themselves with the easy menace of men who'd done this before. The cabin wasn't much, but Jonah had built it to last. He yanked the shutters closed, slid iron bolts into place, then grabbed the box of cartridges from the table. "We've got cover, we've got high ground," he said, his voice low but steady. "They'll try to wait us out." "How long can we last?" she asked. "Long enough," he said, but his eyes told her he wasn't certain. The day dragged, each minute stretched tight. They took turns watching the tree line, speaking only in whispers. Once, she caught sight of Briggs through the scope, close enough to see the frayed edge of his coat, but she held her fire. Jonah had told her, "Don't shoot unless you have to." Late in the afternoon, Jonah used the lull to teach her how to reload faster, how to keep her breathing even, how to use the shadows inside to mask her position. She listened like her life depended on it, because it did. Night fell fast in the mountains, swallowing the last scraps of daylight. Jonah lit no lamps moving through the cabin by feel. The first test came just after midnight. A scuff of boots on the porch, a low murmur, then the dull thud of someone trying the door. Jonah met her eyes, held up 2 fingers, 2 men. She took her position by the side window while he moved silently to the front. The hammer of his Colt clicked back. The knock that came next was almost polite. "Hale," Briggs called softly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Jonah's voice was calm, flat. "You've already made it hard." A pause. "I don't want to kill you. Just need that reward. Step outside and I'll see she comes to no harm." Anna's grip on the rifle tightened until her knuckles ached. Jonah's answer was a single shot that blew a splinter the size of a man's finger out of the doorframe. Footsteps scrambled back into the dark. The siege stretched into the second day. Supplies were fine. Water from the creek, flour and salt pork enough for a week, but the strain was wearing them both down. Anna caught herself studying Jonah in the quiet moments, the hard line of his jaw, the way he rolled his shoulders to ease the weight of waiting. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, if he still saw the woman from that dusty church, or something harder now. On the third night, the weather turned. Clouds moved in, heavy and low, muting the moonlight. Jonah took it as a sign. "They'll use the dark to get close," he told her. "We'll use it to end this." He outlined the plan in a whisper. She'd stay at the window with the rifle. He'd slip out the back, circle wide, and push them toward her line of sight. It was madness, and she knew it, but she didn't argue. When he left, the cabin felt too big. Every creak of the logs amplified. She kept her cheek to the stock, eyes straining against the dark. A shadow moved, then another. And then Briggs. She recognized his broad frame, the way he carried his rifle low. She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang in her ears, echoing through the trees. Briggs dropped to one knee, clutching his arm. Shouts erupted, figures scattered, and then Jonah's voice cut through the chaos. "Anna, down!" She hit the floor just as a round shattered the window above her. Jonah was back a heartbeat later, dragging her toward the stone hearth. "It's over," he said, breathing hard. "They're gone." "Gone?" she asked. He nodded. "Briggs won't come back with a hole in his arm and his pride in pieces. The others didn't sign on for a war." By dawn, the world had gone quiet again. Smoke curled from the cabin chimney. The creek sang in the distance. Jonah stood on the porch, watching the trail. Anna came to stand beside him. "What now?" "We keep living," he said, and for the first time since the day she walked into that church, she believed him. 2 weeks passed before Jonah spoke the words. "We're going to town." Anna set down the tin plate she'd been drying. "To finish this?" He nodded. "Some ghosts follow you until you face them." The morning was cold enough to frost their breath, but the trail down from the high country was softening with spring thaw. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves over mud and stone. Below them, the valley opened like a book left in the sun. Patches of green pushing through the last crusts of snow, the creek swollen and silver in the light. Anna wondered if the people in Bitter Creek would look at her with the same suspicion they had that first day in the church. She didn't fear it the way she once did. The town was waking when they arrived. Wagons clattered over the planks. A black dog lay sprawled in front of the bakery. The smell of fresh bread reached them before the sound of the bell above the door. Jonah dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, Sheriff McKenna sat behind a desk littered with papers and a half-empty coffee cup. "Well," McKenna said slowly, "didn't figure you for a man who'd walk back into my office." "Didn't figure I'd have reason to," Jonah replied. He dropped a worn satchel on the desk. It hit with the heavy clink of metal. "Found this stashed up in the rocks by Copper Ridge. Guns, papers, things from the Bitter Creek stage job." McKenna's gaze moved from the satchel to Jonah's face. "You're saying you found it?" "I'm saying it wasn't mine," Jonah said, "and you can prove it now." Anna stood just inside the doorway, watching the exchange. She saw the calculation in McKenna's eyes, saw the moment the truth tipped the scales. "This'll clear your name. the sheriff said at last. "Not that every tongue in the county will stop wagging right away." "Paper don't change a man's past," Jonah said, "but it can make the future a little cleaner." Outside, Anna touched his arm. "You could have stayed up there forever. Why risk coming down?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Because I want the life we're building to stand on solid ground, no shadows in the corners." They spent the day in town, buying flour, coffee, nails for the roof, and a pair of boots for her that she insisted she didn't need. At the general store, Mrs. Ellery studied her for a long moment before saying, "I hear you're Mrs. Hale now." Anna smiled. "That's right." The woman's expression softened. "Well, the mountains have a way of keeping the right people." When they were ready to leave, Anna noticed McKenna on the boardwalk tacking a fresh notice over the old one. The wind caught the corner, and she read the words, "The reward for Jonah Hale is hereby withdrawn." The knot that had sat in her chest since the night of the siege finally loosened. She didn't look back again. The climb home was slow, the pack mule heavy with supplies. By the time the cabin came into view, chimney smoking, fence mended, the ridge rising like a shield behind it, the sun was low and gold. Jonah dismounted and began unloading the mule. "You still want to stay?" he asked. She looked at the cabin, the creek, the mountains holding the sky. "I'm not staying," she said. "I'm home." That night, after stew and fresh biscuits, they stepped out onto the porch. The pines whispered in the wind. Stars hung cold and clear above the ridge. "Briggs won't be the last," she said. "No," Jonah agreed, "but next time they'll know we're ready." They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, until the cold drove them back inside. And in that quiet, Anna understood. The mountains didn't care about guilt or innocence. They cared about endurance, and together they would endure.